Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook. Let's talk about the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery. It was called The Examples. And it opens with a couple of ships hanging out in the area of the dark matter anomaly, aka the DMA, that's been tearing through space and blowing up planets and messing with star bases and so forth in the fourth season thus far. And the ships are kind of talking back and forth when all of a sudden the DMA just disappears, which was pretty strange. But the thing of note here is that the ships that are mentioned are the USS Janeway, which of course is named for Catherine Janeway, played by Kate Mulgrew, and the Vulcan ship, the NSS T'Pau. Now, what's funny about that is 2 weeks ago, they did an episode where there was a transfer of consciousness between Gray and Gray's new robot body, which reminded me of the scene at the end of Star Trek 3, where Spock's consciousness gets transferred back to him from McCoy, and I couldn't remember the name of the Vulcan priestess that did the transfer.
July.
And I was trying to think of it and coming up with different names of other Vulcan lady characters that they've had on the shows over the years. And one of the ones I mentioned was T'Pau, who officiated at
Spock's wedding
in the episode Amok Time. But now they've shown us a ship named after her, which was pretty cool. It's kind of a real throwback reference that only longtime Star Trek fans would really get. So that was pretty cool and pretty coincidental that I had just only brought her up a couple of weeks ago in my review. Anyway, it seems like the DMA can relocate itself all at once, instantaneously, from one part of the galaxy to another. And when the crew discovers this, it prompts them to think that it's under someone's control, because a natural phenomenon wouldn't just do that. The next thing that happens is they figure out that the DMA is headed directly for a non-Federation colony that's, I guess, set up on some asteroids that are grouped together. It was really strange. But anyway, the Admiral sends several ships to evacuate it, even though they're non-Federation. And when he tells Michael that he wants the Discovery to jump there, she says, "I'll lead the operation myself," meaning the evacuation. Just sort of assuming command of the whole ground operation on her own authority, which, okay, it's Michael. She does this. So that was a little strange. And again, I don't understand why they keep showing the Discovery at Starfleet headquarters. Like, that's not normal. The ships are just out there. Even when there's a dark matter anomaly and they're on a specific mission to research it, they're still generally just out in space somewhere, not hanging around Earth. So it's really weird that they keep having these in-person meetings right at Starfleet headquarters. It's just not a thing in Star Trek, where, you know what I'm saying, where they hang around Starfleet headquarters and just keep having in-person meetings. It was never a thing. So I don't know why they keep doing it. But anyway, they're having another one of those meetings in this episode, during which what I just said happens. And also at this meeting, the Admiral mentions that there are 4 different species that Starfleet thinks could be behind the DMA. One of them is the Iconians. It's a very old civilization that used to travel from point to point in the galaxy by using gateways rather than any kind of starship that were first seen in The Next Generation and then later on other Star Trek shows. The second race he mentions is the Metrons. Those are the super powerful beings that made Captain Kirk fight the Gorn captain in that one episode. I think it was called Arena, because they determined both races were savage races and decided that they had to fight or whatever. The third race he mentions is the Nassine, who of course are the caretakers from Star Trek Voyager, the people that built the caretaker array. And the Q continuum, which was really interesting that he mentions them. But he said it's unlikely that it's them because one, this isn't the kind of thing that they do, and it would be really strange because they've not made contact with Federation, I guess, space or the area of the galaxy that the Federation is in over 600 years, at least not to the Admiral's knowledge. So that was pretty cool that they mentioned all those races and entities. Upon arrival at the colony, it is discovered that there are a handful of prisoners being detained and also denied the opportunity to evacuate because they're criminals and they're being, I guess they've been set up as examples of don't commit crimes. And so the planet leadership was just going to leave them there. And Michael kind of says, well, no, we're not doing that. This is a Federation mission. We don't leave people behind. And the magistrate of the colony says, well, I don't know how you're going to do it because all the people who operate the prison are gone and it's biometric. And so nobody else can operate it or whatever. He gives them some reason why it's not going to work. And Michael's like, yeah, okay, whatever. I'm going to get them out. Meanwhile, Stamets bristles at having to work with the guy who's building off of his work on Spore Tech to create the next Spore Drive with Stamets' help. He's been sending him information and consulting with him from a distance, I guess. But he doesn't really want to work with this guy because he hasn't been appreciative of that help. Nonetheless, he has to. Lieutenant Reese volunteers to lead the evacuation in Michael's place when she volunteers for the prison rescue. And it was cool to see that because these characters never do anything, these other bridge characters. And a little later, we even get a scene where he talks a little bit about a devastating tornado that happened to his town during his childhood, when he's giving Michael an update on his progress with evacuating the people from the potential disaster that's about to befall them. So it was cool, except for the part where he's talking about how a tornado menaced his town as opposed to something else. Because weather control systems have existed in Star Trek since the 22nd century. So the idea that Earth, where it would seem he's from, didn't have weather control technology in the 23rd century to prevent things like tornado disasters from occurring was a little strange. But then again, the writers don't know what they're doing in this universe. So there you go. Michael and Book soon encounter a defense mechanism at the prison, which consists of these little mobile landmine type creatures that are disguised to look like life forms. But they realize they aren't real because of how precisely one of them was moving around in the same pattern. And apparently, according to Book, no living thing moves that precisely, which I don't know how he could know that. I don't know how anybody could know that. It was just a dumb thing to say. Anyway, if you've ever played Gears of War, these were like the tickers. These little creatures that could walk up, like crawl up on you and explode. Anyway, they have to disable them so they can get near the prison. Meanwhile, back at Discovery, Stamets and the visiting guy decide to set up a wormhole, a mini wormhole on Discovery to investigate a theory about the DMA. Culber meets with Glasses Guy. I guess his name is Kovich. I just call him Glasses Guy for some reason, and talks about how he's struggling because the DMA is super scary and killing people, and this all happening against the backdrop of him having died and come back to life, and he now has survivor's guilt, and especially because he's been a counselor lately and he's dealing with these people that are all frazzled, and Glasses Guy basically tells him to buck up and get a hobby. take a vacation, take some time off. Whatever. It turns out that the prisoners don't want to go with Michael because they're afraid of being returned to their captivity once their society gets reestablished, wherever that would happen. And I guess would rather die, but then they basically request asylum if they're going to leave. They said, okay, well, we want asylum. They don't call it that, but that's what they say, that they want to be under Starfleet's protection or whatever, or the Federation's protection, which Burnham doesn't really seem to know how to deal with at first, and only manages to tell them she'll try. But it should have been much easier than that. They're requesting asylum, like it's not an unheard of concept. The Federation would have very specific protocols for that. And, that request would immediately sort of put them under their jurisdiction and under their protection while their case was looked at, just like in the real world when you request asylum in a particular country, or even an embassy, which again is like being in another country. And she would have known this from the moment they made the request, unless she's an idiot. She's a Starfleet captain. How do you not know that the Federation has an asylum protocol? Visiting guy goads Saru into shouting at him when he pushes Saru to allow he and Stamets to draw more power from, I guess, part of the ship for their experiment in a risky way. And it just was a really stupid moment, if you ask me. I don't know why they did it, other than to demonstrate that this visiting guy is weird. Anyway, back at the prison, oh, what do you know? Michael has gone through a whole bunch of documents, I guess, in her little comm badge display computer thing, and realizes, oh, hey, we have a thing called asylum, and we can grant you asylum according to regulations. Well, duh. Why does she need to look that up? Even Book would have known, by the way, Michael, the Federation can grant them asylum. Like, because even a civilian would know that. So she comes out and says, as a Starfleet captain, I can grant you political asylum. No kidding. We know this. Why don't you know this? On their way out of the prison, a force field activates, trapping them inside. And of course, they can't beam out or communicate through it, but that's okay. They reactivate the fake creature landmine things, and they come in and blow open the door. And this is one of those things that comes in real handy when you have a comm badge that basically projects a display that you can then use your fingers and operate basically a computer and do various things, which apparently includes hacking an alien landmine tech from a distance. Whereas in the older shows where they didn't have that, they would have to literally go up to it and use tools on it, physical tools. So now they don't even have to do that. Now they can present a threat or whatever that's at a distance, and they can operate it. They don't have to call up to the ship. They don't have to modify a tricorder. They can just go, boop, and the screen comes up, and they can just hack it. They're accessing the ship remotely and can hack it with the ship's computer or whatever tech is in the badge remotely. It's kind of silly. It's like Star Trek's version of the sonic screwdriver. They can do anything with it now because it's a computer. Anyway, they blow open the door. Saru ends up shutting down the experiment before it destroys the ship because it was starting to get out of hand. Back on the asteroid colony, one of the prisoners says he's staying behind because he wants to face his fate, whatever it may be, as part of his penance for the crime he committed. And Michael declines to force him to go, realizing that his fate is his own. She can't force him to leave if he doesn't want to, as long as he's of sound mind, which it would seem that he is. And Book finds this a little bit unnerving. He's kind of not happy with Michael when she does this. He's like, you can't just leave this guy to die. He's going to die. The anomaly's on its way. So she's like, we don't know that. It might come near here. It might not. We're evacuating as a precaution. So he's kind of pissed that she allows the guy to stay behind. Now, the guy gives Michael a little thingy that apparently is part of the crime that he wants to atone for. He apparently killed a guy during a robbery, and unknowingly, when he stole some things from the guy, stole this orb, which really is a sort of digital family tree that unlocks, information about the family's heritage and allows the family to maintain a record of their heritage. And he feels really bad about that. And so he gives it to Michael and says, you have to return this to the person I took it from. He or she or they, the family, are probably members of the people, the group of people that were evacuated. So she says, okay, I'll do it. And she leaves him behind. When it becomes impossible for him to be beamed up because the anomaly gets close and disrupts everything, and when it is simultaneously obvious at that point that the DMA is in fact going to hit the asteroid colony, before Discovery departs, the man offers a confession. He didn't explain all of this completely to Michael on the planet, but I mentioned what he actually did so you'd understand why he gives you the orb. But at this point, he tells the whole story. And Michael hears his confession, and when she wants to put up the cone of silence and just kind of hear it one-to-one, he says, no, it's okay, everybody can listen. And so he tells his story, and then Discovery jumps away just before the DMA hits, and of course the guy dies. The weird thing about that was she just goes, "Black alert, jump." And Book had only just come back up to the ship with her, and Stamets was, as far as we know, working on the data that he and the other guy managed to gather while operating the mini wormhole. And she doesn't say anything about tell Stamets or Book to get to the spore drive, or she doesn't say, is Commander Stamets in the spore booth? And she doesn't or call down and say, Commander Stamets, are you in the spore booth, or can you get to the spore booth? No mention of that. It's just, she just goes, "Black alert, jump," like it's just pushing a button on the bridge and you go, like warp drive. No, someone has to be in the booth. And they don't mention that at all. They don't refer to it at all. And it's like, wait a minute. How do you know? How do you even know? She only just got back on the ship. How does she even know if Stamets or Book are even in the booth to operate it? It was just kind of stupid. At this point, the magistrate storms onto the bridge. Somehow he just had access. Not sure how that works. To express anger at Michael rescuing the prisoners, prompting her to basically say, "Too bad, so sad. Get over it." The next scene is a scene with Dr. Culber and Stamets. They're having a conversation about how Stamets and the visiting guy are very similar in that they're both single-minded about their work and tend to get lost in it. And when he asks the doctor how he's doing, he sort of lies about how he's doing without fooling Stamets for a second. At which point they have a conversation. The conversation shifts to being about how they're both kind of the same in terms of their individual damage, and how they're both amazed by the fact that they can contribute to the work of the crew and help do things like solve the burn and figure out the DMA, but they can't figure out their own shit. Which I have to say I did find very relatable. It's something that a lot of people experience. They're very good at what they do when it comes to their work and solving problems not related to themselves, but then their own life is kind of awash in problems. That's a thing that people experience. It's part of the human condition. And so I thought it was good that they sort of included that. I thought, it was a little too pat maybe, and kind of like lip service. I thought it was a little on the nose. Like a lot of times, yeah, I don't know. Let me see if I can explain in a second here. I'm going to get through the rest of the episode, and then we'll come back to that. The next scene is the ship's computer informs Michael that she can tell that she's sad about what happened to the prisoner guy. She being Zora, the ship. And that she recognizes that it can be difficult to balance duty and compassion, which surprises Michael because she didn't realize that the computer had that ability. And the computer informs her at that point that it can feel emotions, which is crazy. But they kind of leave that there, even though it's kind of like a big thing, like your computer is sentient, your ship is sentient. Like, I guess they knew that, but they didn't know the extent of it. And apparently it's a recent development that it can feel emotions. But okay, cool. So, you've developed the ability to, okay, cool. Check you later. Like, really? You're not going to talk about that? Okay. I mean, I assume there's going to be more about it later, but like, I don't know why they do things the way they do on the show. Anyway, Michael then returns the Heritage Ball orb thing to a woman from the evacuated area. And, this is the one that was stolen from her family by the guy so that she can reconnect with her heritage and see that it continues to be recorded, but doesn't tell her about the guy. She just sort of says, I came across this and it belongs to you. And it was a pretty cool moment. Not only because, hey, she got this thing back and the guy would be happy, but also because she doesn't bother going into the fact of this is from a guy who stole it from you and he was very guilty about it. And she didn't really need to go into all that. And she didn't. So I thought that was cool. I thought it, it sort of made it more poignant that she sort of kept that tragic part of it from her, and didn't sort of burden her with all that information. So that was cool. Right before the episode ends, Booker briefly has a drink with the visiting guy when he shows up in the bar that Booker's drinking in. And during the conversation, he gets the feeling that the guy knows who built the DMA and who's controlling it. And the guy doesn't exactly deny this, but he swears he doesn't. He does say he doesn't actually know, but I guess he has a suspicion, or he realizes that it's not. He says something like, "Well, I'll tell you what, it's not the Iconians," and something like that. And then he goes on to explain how whoever it is would need an immense amount of power at their disposal. And Michael notices a weird sort of tattoo or scar on the back of his neck that he seems to find disturbing, and I'm not quite sure why that is. And we're going to find that out, I'm guessing, as the season moves on. But that's where they ended the episode. And, I didn't think much of this episode, as is normally the case. I thought it had some cool moments. As I was saying, the conversation between Culber and Stamets, even the conversation between Culber and Kovich, or whatever his name is, glasses guy. I very much liked the element of the plot where these people had been left behind to sort of die because they had committed crimes. And Michael wasn't having it, of course, and no one, no Starfleet captain would have allowed that, and went to rescue them. And it turns out that the one guy decided for himself that no, what he had done was too grievous, and that simply returning the orb after all this time wasn't enough to make it right, and that he was going to stay behind and let his fate be his fate. And Book doesn't approve of that, and Michael allows it, but is shaken by it and not happy about his choice, but begrudgingly goes along with it because the only option would be to force him to do something else. And I thought that was a good story element. The thing is that it was underdeveloped in this episode because they've serialized this show, and so they have to deal with the overarching story for part of the episode. And they've also set it up like a soap opera where all the little character groups have to have moments in every episode. Whereas on the previous shows, they didn't really do that. They did to an extent, but it wasn't, there was an A plot and a B plot on the old show. Okay, so you'd have the A plot of the week where maybe it would be an issue like, hey, we have to rescue these people from this prison because they've been left to die. And you find out, oh, this one guy wants to die. And we're going to struggle with that for the whole episode and examine, the human condition side of that. What do we do? Do we honor his wish and leave him behind? Do we say, no, that's crazy. Your life is valuable. You can atone for your crimes some other way. They would have spent the whole episode, the whole A plot dealing with that kind of thing on the old shows. And then the B plot might well have been the thing with Stamets and Culber and, that whole dynamic of, wow, we really work too hard and we don't take time for our own mental health. And isn't it weird how we can be contributing to the solving of problems that don't directly relate to us in a successful way, but we are unable to deal with our shit without help, without leaning on, the services of others, like a counselor. That would have been the B plot. And each of those stories would have been well gone through in the course of a single episode. And the B plot, you might see more of that story in future episodes in little moments. But, and we may still on this show, but I don't know. This show, I think, paid sort of short shrift to that story because it comes out of nowhere. They didn't build to it over the course of previous episodes. And then they just wrap it up in a bow. Isn't it crazy how we can't handle our own shit? And then we may or may not see more about it. I suspect we will, but we may not. So I don't know. I think they're better off going through it thoroughly in the course of a single episode where they they build to it, and they kind of did a little bit, but not really. Where they show him interact, they show Culber interacting with people and getting more and more shaken. They would have done this in the other show, or in another Star Trek show, during the moments that they spent showing the stupid wormhole experiment that they only had to do because they've decided to serialize the show and have this overarching plot of the DMA. But if they weren't doing that, they could have spent this episode on 2 plots instead of like 3. And the 2 plots would have been better for it. As far as the prison story goes, they could have spent, as I said, a lot of time getting down into the nitty-gritty of that and exploring Michael and Book's sort of reaction to how this guy wants to handle the situation, and having discussions about it back and forth that took up several minutes rather than 30 seconds where she goes, well, if that's what you want to do, I think it's a bad idea, but we have to let you. And Book kind of goes, this is not right. So they reduced that whole thing that could have been a real examination of the human condition and of the concept of being in control of your own destiny, which plays into the whole assisted suicide thing, which is a controversy in real life, and which they've sort of dealt with before. There was an episode of Star Trek Next Generation with David Ogden Stiers from MASH and Majel Barrett Roddenberry, where she falls in love with his character, and he's basically refusing to go back to his planet because he's over a certain age, and on his planet you have to voluntarily kill yourself for the benefit of society, so that society doesn't have to deal with older people and the burden that puts on society. And he's like, no, I don't want to do that. And it's like a big thing because he's, bucking the societal trend that everyone just accepts. And there's a whole examination of the value of life past a certain age, and, individual importance versus, the value of the individual versus the value of society, which is the kind of thing that it's a kind of issue that humans struggle with in real life. And so they examine that whole thing over the course of a whole episode, and they really get into it. Now, there was probably a B plot in that episode that took up some time, but they were able to examine it more fully. This was the same kind of thing where they could have delved into this concept for most of the episode, but they reduced it down to a couple of minutes. And to the credit of the guy that played the prisoner, he did a really good job. He was very solemn, and I really believed that he had done this thing that he regretted, and that he had resolved himself to accept whatever his fate was. And he was very solemn about it and somber about it and sincere about it and earnest about it. And I saw that coming through his performance, and the lines they gave him were well written. But I would have liked to see more of it. I would have liked to see him explain his case more. I would have liked to hear him talk about his history that informed his decision. I would have liked to have, it would have been cool if the family member that ended up getting the orb back was brought into the discussion somehow. Oh, that, she knows what he did somehow. They could have written it that she knew what he did, and at the beginning sort of wanted him to die, wanted him to remain behind. But at the end, after getting to know him, for however they would have written that she realized that, no, you can forgive people, and then have her at the end of the episode not wanting him to die, but him choosing to anyway, and saying, I understand, thank you, but I really feel, thank you for forgiving me, but I really cannot forgive myself. And having her have to come to terms with having gone from one position to the next position, to having to accept his decision and being able to have peace with it. That would have been a great story. But instead, they scratched the surface of this concept because they wedged this plot into an episode that they spent time dealing with other plots in. Like I said, the other shows always had a B plot, so it's fine that they didn't spend the whole, if they hadn't spent the whole episode on it, and if they'd had the B plot of the Culber Stamets thing. But I would have liked to see that maybe take up 15 minutes of the 48 and have the other 33 minutes be the story of this guy and the family that he took the orb from, and everybody coming to terms with how it all went down. But instead, on top of that, they had to deal with the stupid DMA plot. And I know that the Culber Stamets thing stemmed from that, but they could have found another way to do that. They didn't have to spend however many minutes of the episode they spent on the DMA thing. I mean, they did because they have the DMA plot to begin with, but they shouldn't have that. There shouldn't be a serialized plot on the show. It should be episode to episode, week to week, news stories, episodic. And I just think that the story that they came up with for this guy was really good, and then it suffered for being reduced down to just one of 3 plots in the episode. So I don't know. I hope going forward they stop doing that. I don't think they're going to, because they're kind of locked into the DMA plot. So this may continue to happen. It's really a shame. We're told that Strange New Worlds is going to do more of that episodic thing with encapsulated stories. So maybe we'll see some great stories, that dive deep into these sorts of intellectual issues that explore the human condition. Maybe we'll get it from there. We're not getting it on Discovery, and I think it's terrible. I think they really should have spent more time with this guy's story instead of the stupid screaming scene, among others, which makes me want to scream. Anyway, that's really all I have to say about this episode. I think it had great moments. I think it had potential, but they squandered it because they're committed to this serialized setup. One good thing, we didn't have to deal with Adira or Gray in this episode, and I hate to say that because I don't have anything against transgender characters or non-binary characters or anything like that, but I think the Gray character is horrible. And I've watched some other people's reviews of the previous episode, and I realized that they made a really big mistake with Adira that just sort of ruins her character for me, which is that she has the memories of a Starfleet admiral as a Trill host, as a host of a Trill symbiote, and yet she's this sort of, shy, not confident, inexperienced character. And when I say inexperienced, I mean in terms of Starfleet, protocol and how to be an officer, but that makes no sense because she would have all the memories of a guy who was an admiral. Not to mention the fact, and I don't remember this, but apparently when she first was introduced in season 3, she was a lot more confident. She was an officer in the Earth Defense Force, but they're treating her here like she's some dumb kid that, so that totally ruined the character for me, that they're treating it that way when it doesn't make any sense. So in that way, I'm glad she wasn't in this episode. Oh, and by the way, I haven't mentioned this yet either. I'm also extremely glad that Michelle Yeoh is not on the show anymore as that horrible Georgiou character. That plot line was going nowhere. They say she's going to get her own show. I don't believe it. It ultimately went nowhere in terms of Discovery itself. The lines they were giving her were not good for her speech patterns, and it just came off lame, and it was a distraction from other stuff to have that plot line. It didn't fit to me, so I'm glad we don't have to deal with that. But speaking of Michelle Yeoh, she does have a movie coming out. I forget what the name of it is, but it looks very interesting. It's a multiverse type story that she's at the center of, her character, and it looks pretty wacky, pretty wild. So I'm going to watch that because I like her. Did not like her as this character. Did not like the character. So I'm glad she's not been in it as well. Thank goodness they got rid of her. Anyway, they got rid of the character. So anyway, I'll be back with a review of the next episode. Until then, of course, I wish you all peace and long life.